Hi, welcome back to the Create Me Free podcast, where we explore how health and circumstance impact our creativity. I am Catherine Versillo. This is my podcast, and it uses a framework that I have developed over years of research and my own lived experience of having health impact my creativity. The framework is called Creative Health Cartography, and it looks at how health impacts creativity across 6 areas: creative process, medium, content, productivity, identity, and business or sustainability. And if you've been following the podcast so far, you might have noticed that I am using audio only this time, whereas I was using video before. I was thinking about it and I realized I never watch any videos that are associated with podcasts. So I'm not sure why I was recording them. I only listen to the audio. That's my own personal preference. I think I was kind of automatically taking the advice that's out there about what's trending right now, maybe. More even subconsciously than consciously. But I thought, well, I'm going to try for a few episodes to see how just audio is received. And we'll see how that goes. If you have been listening for a little while now and you have any opinion or preference, I'd love to hear from you just to get different feedback. So if you have been listening for a little while, then you know that we're working through my framework. I'm giving you in season 1 here kind of the lay of the land of what I mean about how health impacts creativity. So we started out by looking at how it impacts creative process, and we then looked at how it affects creative medium, and that's what we've covered so far. Now we are moving on to creative content. So this episode and the next few to follow are all related to creative content. Um, so let's get started. Content. What do we mean by content? It means the thing that you write about. So if creative process was how you, or I said write about, but it could be any art that you're creating. It's the thing I write about, considering myself mostly a writer. So if creative process is how you create, creative medium is the materials you use to create, creative content is the what you create. It's the subject. It's the subject of the writing, the subject of the art, the subject of the film, the content. Content's such a weird word these days because of how it's become associated with content consumption and production online. Like, oh, this podcast is content. But it really means what's inside of that content, I suppose, as a way of looking at it. So it's subject matter, but that's kind of just one part of it. So subject matter meaning I paint a painting of a hospital room. The subject is the hospital, maybe. I write a poem about someone who has passed away. The subject is the person, or the subject is grief. I write, maybe I shouldn't say write. I create a song about a character who is living with schizophrenia. So that's the subject matter. That's the kind of surface level, though. Underneath the surface level sits kind of a deeper level to the content, and it's really kind of what the work is reaching towards. What are the questions that it opens again and again as you're working on your creative piece? What is the emotional terrain that happens as you come back to this content? So it's kind of goes twofold. It's what you're. So for me personally, I'm one of those people who will say that I write to understand what I'm thinking. And that has to do with my creative process, but it also has to do with content because I can look at the content of what I'm creating and it can give me clues as to what is under the surface that's trying to come out. When we do in my mapping workshops with people, a lot of what we do is intuitive. We are using collage and map making to surface content that we may not realize is there. So we look at it on the page as we've put together this collage and go, oh, that's interesting. That's a piano. Why did I put that there? The content is the piano, but the content is also whatever is going on underneath. Perhaps your feelings about music or a feeling that you're out of harmony or step in your life somehow, as an example. So the content is both of those things. So when we think about health often, so often the work that we create is in some way autobiographical, or at the very least trying to answer a question that is coming from inside of us. And illness tends to take up our attention, at least for a period of time. Acute illness right in that moment. Chronic illness can be in the background sometimes, it can be in the foreground sometimes, but it arrives and it sits down in your field of attention, and it often emerges as some kind of content that you're working through as you're processing it emotionally. So, disability often reorganizes what feels present or urgent. Grief is a really common one. In the midst of grief, that tends to be the only thing we can feel, and it's shocking to us that the world goes on. So the emotion gets our attention, and the work that follows tends to incorporate that, but it's not always in the same way. We're all different, right? And we're all in different places at different times with our work. So the work might meet all of that head on and be really obvious. I'm writing a poem about grief after losing someone and it's about them, or it can glance at it kind of sideways. I write a poem about the abyss and I realize I'm writing about depression, something. It can also seem like it's not related at all um, to your health, but then as you develop a body of work, you might look back and go, oh, when I look at the topic I was writing about then and what was happening with my health, this makes sense now. Sometimes it happens in retrospect. I'm trying to think. It's kind of interesting. I think often, but not always, content involves other people too, in a way. In a way that's different from, I think, medium for the most part. So when I make a piece about depression, I'm making it about my depression or my experience of it, but then it becomes art perhaps when other people can relate to that. And they tend to relate to the content. Now they can relate to the medium and they can relate to all these, but the content is really generally the thing that connects the inside of what we are creating to the outside of what people are receiving. And other people show up in other ways too, like sometimes ethical ways. So if I'm creating from trauma and there are other people who are in my story of trauma, if I create in a way that puts them in the art, there's questions around that sometimes. There's ethics around that. If I write a memoir, do I change everybody's names and identifying details, for example? Or do I put the people in it? These are just these are ways that people show up in our content in a way that doesn't happen so much with process or medium. Yeah, so hopefully that makes sense. Content is what you make, which may include other people, and it may be really obviously tied to your health, or it may be much less obvious. So I'm opening the workbook right now. So I have created this creative health cartography workbook that goes through some questions and exercises and a little bit of writing around each section. And you can find that on my website, createmefree.com. You can also find it through my Substack, createmefree.substack.com, or the print version is available via Amazon under my name as the author. So if that's something that interests you, you can purchase it in PDF or in print. In each of these podcast episodes, or at least a few of them for each section, I'm kind of going through the workbook and looking at some things to share with you. So I think each section begins with a Dear Artist letter. I'm wondering if I should read some of this letter. The letter I chose for this one is called Dear Artist Who Misses Warmth in Your Own Words. And I guess that speaks to the emotion behind the content. And it doesn't necessarily mean words literally. It could mean whatever content medium you create in. Whatever medium you create your content in. So it begins, Dear artist whose work feels colder than it used to. Dear creative wondering if you've gone numb. Dear storyteller afraid you've lost your voice. Dear maker who keeps creating but feels nothing as you do. Dear thinker whose once rich ideas feel flat on the page. Dear soul who worries your spark is gone. Dear human who can't remember the last time your art surprised you. This is for you. And then the letter goes on. And I won't read the whole letter here, but I'll read the end of it to give you the sense of the warmth you are missing is not just about creativity. It is about connection. Connection with yourself, your truth, the parts of you that once felt safe showing up. If the safety has shifted, your work will shift too. You may not be able to push for warmth. Instead, try courting curiosity. What stories do you long to tell? What parts of your process feel like performance? What happens when you write only for yourself, just for a moment? Sometimes we can feel really out of touch with our content of our work, and I think it's because we're surfacing those questions, but it's not clear yet. It's not coming through quite yet. So the content doesn't look familiar to us and may not feel the warm, real, authentic until later. Yeah. Also in each chapter, I have identified some common blocks and common strengths for each category. So the blocks, what is happening, how do I say it? You might have a symptom of something that indicates a block in the area of how health is impacting content. A very obvious one. Health themes appear in your work whether you intend them to or not, and you're not sure how you feel about that. If that's happening for you, then of the domains that I use in my framework, content may be the one we want to work with. It keeps showing up as content and you don't know how you feel about it, and let's figure that out. That's one of them. Another block is, I don't know how I phrased it in here, but it's the forbidden subject. So you know with like complete clarity what you need to be making about, and yet you aren't. Actually, you probably are, but you're probably going really roundabout, and it doesn't look like you are, because these things really just show up in our work, right? But a lot of times we avoid directly creating around the work itself. And sometimes that's super necessary. Sometimes that is a nervous system response, that is a way of protecting ourselves, and it's perfectly healthy. We don't owe anyone, our trauma narrative or work created about our illness. But if it is there and you're intentionally avoiding it, then it's good to know that and figure out consciously and intentionally how you want to work with that. Another one, you struggle to balance authenticity and truth-telling with the privacy of protecting yourself and others. So if your work feels blocked because you aren't sure how much truth you want to tell, or you're making the work and it feels like it's just scratching the surface in a way that doesn't feel good. It feels like, it's not resonating because it's not really going to that meaty place. That may be for a reason. And that might be, for example, we're talking about other people being in your work. It may be that you need to consider your ethics and goals and beliefs around putting those people in your work and how you want to do that. And then if you do that, maybe you can surface the other stuff differently. Yeah. So let me see. If you create work with hidden layers, fragmentation, or coded meaning that you understand but nobody else does, and you're not sure why, that could be related to content. So those are just some examples of blocks that come up. Now, for every category, there's also adaptations that we make in order to continue creating. So even if you have a block in creative content, your drive to create will compel you to find different ways to work with that. So those are adaptations, capabilities. So I have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them listed here. So one of them is learning how to separate the act of making, which includes all of the things that you make, from the act of sharing. So learning to make fully and completely your authentic self content and separating that from what you choose to share with the world. That is a real strength that allows you to fully embrace your creative self without compromising your ethics or putting yourself out in a vulnerable way when you are not ready to do that, as an example. And another common adaptation is learning to use symbolism or metaphor intentionally to convey what you want to convey without necessarily spilling all of your health story onto the page. Sometimes we do this unintentionally and then it can be blocking for us. But if we are doing it intentionally, it can be a healing, adaptive thing for us. And another strength that happens is really learning to recognize when your creative avoidance is a legitimate form of self-protection versus when it has become a block that costs you more than actually making would. So those are a few of the adaptations you would read about in this workbook and in the work that I do one-to-one with people. Yeah, so what else is in this chapter? Is there anything else I want to share today? We're going to have some exercises, but I think I'll come back to those later. One of them, for example, is the weight of what you carry, and we're going to look at 3 different pieces of work content-wise and explore. I'll just tell you about it now. I'm actually going to come back to it later. So some creative content feels heavier than other content, and your body knows the difference. It knows specifically where it holds the weight. So think about 3 different pieces of work you've made or want to make. One that felt very light, one that felt very heavy, and one that you haven't even been able to start. And the idea here, what we would do in a mapping session together, is we would sit with those and find where they are in the body. Are they in the throat? Are they in the chest? Are they in the head? The body knows what's heavy or too heavy. That's an example of an exercise that is in the workbook and also is something that I work with people. So this is, as I said, the first episode in the section of content. So the way that I'm doing this is this kind of gives you an introduction to what I'm going to talk about in terms of health affecting creative content. This episode is free and available to anyone. And then the other episodes in this section are for paying subscribers of Substack. You can get them all by signing up at createmefree.substack.com. And this is a conscious choice. There's a big temptation for me just to make everything free and available, but I have been doing this work for 20 years now, putting out a lot of material that I've put a lot of time and effort into. And it's a way of acknowledging to myself that this has value. And I don't want to give it away for free. So I want to give some away for free, but I also want to be compensated for the time and energy I put in. So this is just kind of the introduction to content. So one thing I will name, we'll talk about some art history later, artists whose health clearly shows up in their content. I won't necessarily bring her up again in full, but like Frida Kahlo is an artist so many people know. So she ends up being a really easy example for me to use for all of these things. And content is an obvious one. Her self-portraits, autobiographical paintings are images of her health and her life. It's not just her health. Health impacts our creativity and shows up as the content. So her images of herself in bed injured is an example of that content showing up as she processes her experience. But also circumstance impacts our creativity. So her relationship famously with Diego Rivera often impacted her creativity and sometimes showed up as content. So that an impact like that can show up as a medium. You might find that you create a different medium during different circumstances, create with a different medium. It could show up as productivity. You're going through a breakup that's really hard for you, and that may cause you to produce more art or less art. But here we're talking about content and how it actually shows up in what you make. So even if you're making things that are really abstract, there's usually something underneath. There's content even if you don't name the content. And often, honestly, that's even more, it's more powerful to look at that, because if you sit down and write a story that's about yourself, you're writing, usually you're writing what you already understand. So you can go deeper and find ways to go deeper. But if you're writing more abstractly, if you're writing fiction, if you're creating abstract art, if you're dancing out something, there's content there that you might not fully realize is related to your health until you start kind of actively looking at it. So we'll look at some art history and we'll look at some theory. For example, Arthur Frank, who wrote the book The Wounded Storyteller, described 3 shapes that organize how people tell the story of illness. And those are really useful for understanding content, even though it is kind of specific to writing, but it doesn't have to be. We can think more broadly. So his 3 shapes are the restitution narrative, the chaos narrative, and the quest narrative. So the restitution narrative is essentially, I was ill, I got better, and life returned to the way it was before. So illness happened and now it's gone. The chaos narrative is there is no orderly story because the illness has overwhelmed every attempt to make the story. And the quest narrative is the illness became a passage that changed me and I came back carrying something I can offer. That is often what we run up against, especially like for me, creating in this era in public. It often feels like I have to have the answer to something before I can share it with the world. But real health challenges don't work that way. We create at different stages of our conditions and of our understanding of our conditions. So I have written about my experiences with depression many times, and what I wrote 20 years ago mostly is still true from what I have seen looking back, but also it's not what I write now. That is because the shape of the depression has changed, but more than that, my understanding of the depression has changed. So when that is the content of my work, it looks different at different times. The point being that there isn't necessarily a little bow that you tie on. I can't say, okay, I can have a quest narrative and say, okay, I have survived depression to this point, and this is what I've learned, and I bring this to you as an offering. However, that doesn't mean that's the ending of my story. I will live with depression either way, whether I put a bow on it or not. So the quest narrative tends to be the one that shows up most as content in art that's directly storytelling. So books, movies, we tend to expect there to be a beginning, middle, and end, right? And so the end is I came back carrying something to offer. However, Arthur Frank's book, The Wounded Storyteller, it's not claiming that any one of those is better than any of the others. So we may be driven to take something from our illness or our circumstances and transform that through our art into something that is helpful for others. But that isn't necessarily better or worse, or whatever label you want to put on it, than the restitution work or the chaos work. Restitution work tells a story of return. It says that things can happen and things can go back the way they were. Chaos work tends to resist coherence because it's chaos and you're just in the thick of the house. So a lot of really, really intense work about health might be in the chaos narrative. So when you're really creating about what your symptoms are, for example, if you're painting what I don't know what a migraine feels like. Over time, that might be chaos work. I don't know if I'm describing that very well. I'll have to think on how that and come back to it. But each shape, each of those from Arthur Frank carries its own costs, its own gifts, just like the thing we were just talking about with strengths and adaptations in how health impacts content. Um, any of these ways that it comes through in storytelling also has strengths and challenges. Um, so why do we care? Because seeing which shape you are working inside of can change your relationship to the work. Being able to name it helps you understand what you're doing with it. Um, yeah, so that's kind of the gist of one theory that we'll talk about as we continue on here. Um, yeah, so that's where we're at. I guess I feel like this is a pretty short episode, although I can't tell. So when I do the video one, it shows me on my screen how long it is, but I guess it does. Oh, there, it shows me. Okay, it did show me. It's a little shorter than my other episodes, but I really just wanted to introduce you to this idea of content. Oh, I wonder if I was going to tell you some specific examples. Yeah, let me pull that up before we end here. So one of the things I like to look at is various symptoms that we have from various conditions. Um, Obviously, everyone's experience of illness is different, but sometimes we can see, sometimes the symptom and the content are related or are the same thing. So, for example, if you have the symptom of, let's go with pretty easy, well, I shouldn't say easy, acne, bad skin. This can feel really traumatizing, but I think many of us have dealt with it and have survived, and it isn't that as traumatizing. So let's talk about this one as opposed to, say, like childhood abuse. In that sense, acne is a little easier to talk about, right? So if you have themes of visibility in your work, um, anything related to the skin in your work, um, maybe the kind of gap showing inside and outside, like how you feel inside different from how you are perceived outside. Subjects related to shame, self-examination, definitely like with the face, representations of the face. All of these things could be ways that acne comes out in content. And that doesn't mean that you're photographing your acne or writing about your acne. You may find that you're writing about visibility or skin. You're putting that into the imagery of song or dance without ever naming that you're talking about acne. So that's an example. Let me look at some other ones here that I have on my list. I've put a big list together. Detachment. So a lot of times we have detachment. This can be because of trauma. It can be because of various health conditions. It can be because of the stage of an illness that we're at. So if you experience emotional distance and that becomes your subject matter, if you're writing about connection and disconnection, if you're creating work that's around this, if you're creating with cold colors sometimes, or textures such as metals um, that are cooler, that can sometimes be content. I guess that's actually medium, but related to detachment. You may directly address being detached, what it feels, what it cannot feel. But it also might be something like you write a story about an observer who wants to participate in something but can't or doesn't for whatever reason. Or you'll create a dance that has that tension of that you never quite join the group of people dancing. You're outside of it, a detachment. Those are just two examples. I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about when I talk about content and how it might reveal to us a symptom that's showing up, which can then reveal to us kind of, oh yeah, that's why I'm creating that. Okay, let me feel into that more. Yeah, so that's just an example. So I think that's all we're going to talk about today. I am going to close here, and then I will come back next week and we will talk more in detail about how health and circumstance impact creative content. If you have any questions, you can reach me through createmefree.substack.com or my email, which you should be able to find on createmefree.com. And I look forward to sharing more about this with you.